first and foremost redound to the glorification of God and then to the sanctification of humans. So it's first about giving glory to God, giving thanks to God for what God has done, and that in that it also makes us better people.
I have a PhD, but I still often feel like the least intelligent person in the room. Sometimes this is strategic. I like surrounding myself with smart people in hopes that some of their genius might rub off on me. But when I talk to other smart people, I often feel like a little kid playing with his toy trucks in the sandpit while all the bigger kids build impressive structures out of clay. Luckily, a lot of those smart people are my friends, and they don't mind if I ask dumb questions. Turns out a lot of them feel the same way about what I do. The problem is, we often use complicated or unique language that can be intimidating. So I decided to invite my friends to join me in the Sandbox, where we can have fun, ask dumb questions, and learn from each other without worrying about looking stupid. Welcome to Sandbox Conversations.
Because religions are different in how they approach individuals and how they approach titles and everything, rather than me introducing you, I'd love if you could just share with us who you are and how you would define your religious affiliation.
My name is Father Chris Corbin, and I am the rector at Trinity Episcopal Church in Oshkosh. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church. Rector really refers more to my function in the church, which is more or less like senior pastor.
Okay.
So that's what I am. Father, then, is just the title that identifies me as a priest.
Okay. I got to come and watch your sermon this last Sunday. I noticed you had a number of other individuals helping out with things like preparing for the sacraments or helping, even with communion, helping out with that process.
Yes.
What would their position be?
So one of those people was a deacon.
Okay.
And deacons are the third of the three ordained orders that we have, who are people who have specific set-aside functions in the ordering of the life of the church. And deacons we see as having primarily that helper and bridge role. The way we talk about it is that deacons bring the concerns of the world to the church and bring the church then to the world. The mistaken impression I think people have is that the congregation is like the audience for a play, and it's really more that the congregation are the main actors. The sacred ministers are like the stagehands who make sure that they can play their part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did actually really appreciate that your congregation was actively engaged.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a passive.
No.
You're coming, you're just, oh, this is a fun little thing, I'm going to go home. They were all engaged. They
Yep.
were participating, maybe even perhaps, I would see that participating with deity, right? They're making
Yep.
connections with God at that time.
Yes.
So that's really cool.
Yeah, in our understanding of worship, what distinguishes worship from other acts is that, I won't get exactly the language down, but Thomas Cranmer, who is one of the architects of the Book of Common Prayer, which is our main document that contains all of our liturgies, all of our orders of worship, said that what worship consists in is those acts that first and foremost redound to the glorification of God and then to the sanctification of humans. So it's first about giving glory to God, giving thanks to God for what God has done, and that in that it also makes us better people.
I love that. I've been trying to lead my personal prayers to do better at glorifying God first.
Yeah.
I think sometimes my prayers tend to be very selfish.
Yeah.
Here's what I need, and then you know what? And I have found that as I have done better to glorify God first, I have felt more blessings with the other things anyway. So this next part, I don't know how it's going to work for you because you're slightly different than other people I'm interviewing because you do this all the time.
Right.
This is like your life. But I would love to, if possible, I would love to see some sort of separation as we're talking about the Sabbath day as to what it means to you personally.
Right.
And then to what it means congregationally or from your religious perspective there. And I know there's going to be intertwined, so don't feel like you have to completely separate them out. So I guess I just would love to start with your overall view of the Sabbath, what it means to you personally, and perhaps even what it might look like to keep the Sabbath day holy.
Yeah, I think that I personally tend to lean pretty hard into the rest aspect. I try not to check email after services. I tend to have a sense that there's sort of a hard break that once services are done, then through the end of my day off on Monday, I'm off. You can't reach me unless there's an absolute emergency. I spend time with family. That tends to be the day that we go down to visit my in-laws in Fond du Lac and just sort of rest. I often nap. Don't normally nap on other days, but
Sunday naps are great.
Yeah. And there's more I could do. I mean, that's certainly in the historic sweep of what Sabbath observance has meant in the Anglican tradition. And just to clarify some terms here, Anglican tradition means all of those churches that trace their origin back and see themselves in continuity with the Church of England.
Okay.
And technically, to be fair to them, the Anglican Church in Scotland and in Ireland, because they kind of had starts that were at the same time rather than splitting off.
Mm-hmm.
But so the Episcopal Church is the successor body of the Church of England in the United States after the Revolution, and so
Okay.
we consider ourselves the Anglican province in the United States and a couple other countries that had ties to the United States historically. So when I say Anglican, that's really, I'm just talking about the larger tradition that the Episcopal Church belongs to.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just take a step back too and say that there are certainly traditions that still maintain Sabbath observances on Saturday,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Jewish Sabbath.
Yep.
We definitely belong to a tradition that sees the Lord's Day as having taken the place of Saturday Sabbath observance. And so in the Anglican tradition, historically, the understanding was our Sabbath is Sunday rather than Saturday.
Okay. Cool. So two things that I really hear resonating here is one is the rest part,
Mhm.
to take a break from the world, and then the other was relationships. Seemed to
Yeah.
be pretty important for you. Obviously going to church, participating in service is important
Right.
for you because of your position right now. What role does that play for? I mean, I guess even for you, because you partook of the communion while
Yeah.
you were there, right? That's important for you, even as the person running everything here.
Yeah.
It's still important for you. So what role does actually going to church play? Is that a requirement in your church? Is that or
Yes.
are there extra blessings for that? I guess.
So we are a people who are ordered. Our lives are ideally ordered by worship and liturgy throughout all time.
Okay.
So in the Book of Common Prayer, we actually understand there to be kind of three cycles that are running. There's the cycle of daily prayer. So we have morning and evening prayer forms as well as noonday and right before bed if you want to. But certainly morning and evening prayer have always been part of the Anglican tradition, and the expectation was that you would take part in these originally as a community, right? So if we're to go back to like 1589 in pick a random English village, every day, everyone in the morning would go to the church. They'd say morning prayer together. Then they go home, do their day, and then before going to bed, they'd all come in and say evening prayer together. So that's sort of the daily ordering of life around prayer, and then there's the yearly ordering of life around the liturgical calendar. So that is sort of the different seasons of the year. We're finishing up Advent right now, but the preparation for Christ coming. And that sort of acclimates you to the sweep of salvation history. And then there's the life cycle. So things like birth, as marked by baptism, and historically it was called the churching of women. So after when a woman would be able to be brought back into the church community after giving birth. Then there is confirmation, marriage for those who are called to that, ordination for those who are called to it, the healing and anointing of the sick, reconciliation when you've fallen out of relationship with the community, and finally, death and burial. And so there's that life cycle that is also encapsulated there. So that's all to say, if you're really following the book, most of our lives are ordered by this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But the worship on the Lord's Day, which historically would have had communion or Eucharist quarterly, monthly, now it's every week. If you have the means to have that, which means you have a priest in your congregation, the expectation is that there will be your principal service on Sundays with a Eucharist. That day always was set aside as the pinnacle of Christian worship. And we understand every Sunday to be sort of a recapitulation of Easter. There are only a couple services in our cycle of holy days that take precedence over that, and those are all Eucharist services. So you still are going to have Eucharist, but the celebration of the Lord's resurrection is the pinnacle of Christian worship, and it is in our catechism. It says the expectation is that all Episcopalians will worship at least weekly.
Okay.
Does that always happen?
Sure.
No. Does that happen even with most Episcopalians? No. But that is the expectation, that the ideal that should be striven for is weekly attendance at service. And actually getting into sort of the history of Sabbath observance in the Anglican tradition. Some traditions, like the Puritans, really were big on Sabbath observance. Mm-hmm. There's not as much sort of devotional literature in the Anglican tradition as there were for Puritans, but there still was quite a bit, and there was certainly a significant expectation of Sabbath observance. But one of the sort of the big luminaries from the 1700s of Anglican spirituality, named Jeremy Taylor, wrote a book called Holy Living, and one of the sections deals with Sabbath observance on the Lord's Day. And so he really points out that whereas rest was the primary focus under the Old Covenant, and with the actual Ten Commandments themselves, for Christians the real focus is the worship. And so that really is the centerpiece of Sabbath observance for the Anglican tradition. And then rest is sort of ancillary to that, but the rest and the contemplation, the avoiding work, is to serve the ability to worship as fully as possible. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exist sort of as an end in itself.
I love that. First of all, when we ask what the rules are, a lot of times people just say, yeah, here's the rules. The expectation is here. So I appreciate the backstory, because I think understanding the why is really important. Why is this expectation here? The other thing that I think that you've highlighted that hasn't come up in a lot of my other conversations, because I think often we see the Sabbath day as, what do I get out of it? What's the blessing for me? One of the things you've highlighted is this worship aspect.
Yeah.
What role should that play in our lives, to worship on the Sabbath?
Yeah, well, and again, I think that Taylor would say, and I agree, that that's the primary function. Mm-hmm. This is always the thing I say about coming to worship too, and try to say to people, is that it's not about you, mm-hmm. not primarily at least. You know, the language that sort of began to creep into a lot of Christianity around, well, how am I being fed? What's in it for me? Yeah, is, I think, getting the cart before the horse. It's the wrong question to be asking first and foremost. It's, am I able to bring myself as fully as possible before God to praise God, to give thanks to God for what God has done? And so what Taylor talks about is that that also was the focus of sort of synagogue worship as well. The real addition, and I want to be careful here that this is what Taylor says, and not necessarily an accurate representation of what contemporary Judaism understands, but his understanding was the real addition for Christians is, it's not just thanksgiving for creation and preservation, but also for redemption. That really is the additional sort of aspect that is brought in. And there, the center on Christ is really big. It's not just thanks to God the Father for creating and preserving the world, but really big focus on and praise and thanksgiving to Christ for Christ's redeeming work.
Yeah. So a lot of this is a gratitude thing on our part.
Yes.
One of the things that's, I think, interesting to me that I'd love your thoughts on.
Well, I'll say, before you go on with that the word Eucharist, which I keep throwing around, uh-huh. which is a synonym for our communion service, means literally giving thanks. The prayer of the Eucharist is understood as this one huge thanksgiving prayer to God for what God has done.
I appreciate that, because often, especially as an observer, you view Eucharist as I'm going to go up and I'm going to get something.
Right.
But it's really not that. It's I'm going and giving this thanks back to God. I'm praising God.
Well, it's not only that you're getting something. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So I would love your thoughts on this too, though. The way I see God is not this God that's up there like, I need people to praise me so I can be happy, right? And I can go worship him. That doesn't make him more powerful that I'm worshiping him, right? He's already all powerful. So then what role does that worship play? Is that, because there's not the selfish, it's not about me, but at the same time I don't know that benefits God. So then what's the role? How would you view that?
Yeah, so this is, there's a kind of paradoxical way in which letting go of the self to worship God, not because God needs it, but because God deserves it. I think that's maybe the way to put it, right? That understanding who and what God is rightly necessarily calls forth praise. That what God is and who God is a being worthy of praise. And so it's fundamentally just a matter of truth telling. That if you know who God really is, you're going to worship that God. But there is something in it for you, even the sort of letting go of yourself to worship God, because I follow the sort of classical Augustinian tradition, the tradition of the theologian Augustine of Hippo, that really holds strongly, as do many other Christian thinkers, that the chief end of human life is to worship God. That that's what we were created to do, and that's what is going to make us happy. So our well-being is tied up in worshiping God, and in part because that's what we believe, like the vision of the kingdom of God, heaven, the life of resurrection is us gathered around the throne of God, worshiping God for forever. And so this is the dress rehearsal, right? This is when we start getting acclimated to that, because that's what we were created to do. That's what, once sort of the distortions of sin are removed from us, makes us happiest. And so this is how we sort of acclimate ourselves to the fullness of what human life is. So we see the Sabbath worship as entering into that sort of fullness of what human life really is supposed to be.
Thank you for reminding me that God is just worthy of.
Oh yeah, it's fine.
I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that struck me is my students often, they'll fall into this trap of searching for happiness. They want to be happier, and so they're like, I'm going to take some time for me, I'm going to focus on me, try to be happier. And we tend to see those people get less happy.
Yep.
Right? Whereas those who say, I'm going to serve somebody else today, I'm going to create a new habit or hobby today, I'm going to improve life for myself and for other people, that's where you get happiness. And so one aspect of it is God deserves our worship, not because he needs it. It's just that's what truth is.
Right.
Truth is going to necessitate that. But the other thing is sort of this, we get this roundabout blessing back to us as we recognize that truth. It's going to, as you recognize any truth, you grow, you blossom, life becomes better. So
right.
Do you mind if we jump to my big question?
Sure.
I didn't highlight what the bigger one was, but the one that's really been on my mind this year, that I'm really interested to get different thoughts on. We have the 10 Commandments. Mm-hmm. They're obviously important, right? They're the top 10 for me, right? And a lot of them just seem very obvious. Don't kill, don't steal, right? Why, from your perspective, why would God put this commandment we've been talking about, to keep the Sabbath day holy, why would he put it up as one of the top 10 and not just something else like, here's a good thing for you to do? Why is it one of the top 10?
Yeah, I think that, so I think it's interesting that you say this point about, the ones related to what we'd say the second tablet, right? The second table of the law, to human interactions, honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, the ones that order human interchange. I think the bigger question for people in ancient Israel would have been, why are those as big of a deal? Right? That we in the modern world have a tendency to be really immanent and not think so much about what about the first table of the law? Is that really that important? Mm-hmm. And I think some of it gets back to that point, right? Like, God can take it, right? God's big enough. God doesn't need to do this. Yeah. But it's that we look at the holiness code in the Old Testament, and there's stuff that can seem really austere. So I'm thinking of the instance, right, where the ark is being transported and it almost falls, and the attendants, they touch it and they die, right?
Yeah.
That seems crazy to a lot of people today. They're like, what? But I think if we're really, really paying attention enough to the like radical, numinal, transcendent holiness of God, that makes all the sense in the world. That like, obviously, the stuff related to God's holiness is like a really big deal, and like needs the danger signs, needs the warning signs. The other stuff is we're just dealing with other immanent human beings who don't. They bear the image of God, and that's maybe where we begin to get some of that necessity of attending to that sort of stuff. But I'm not fully answering your question so much as I think that the point is we would do well to attend more to the real importance of anything related to God's holiness. That is really the like, that's the starting point, and then everything else flows from that for us, including why we would interact with each other the way we do, why we would honor the dignity of other people. And so maybe this gets to some of it, is I think that we're so accustomed to thinking in terms of just natural rights and inherent dignity of people that the Christian needs to always pull back and say, human beings do have, when viewed just purely from sort of the immanent, in the world perspective, inherent dignity. But when we pull the camera back, we realize, but that dignity isn't actually just a bare matter of truth. It's something that's grounded in God's holiness. That yeah, we can function as though we don't need a deeper rooting for it. But if we really, really start asking ourselves theologically what's going on, it's not that every human being just has inherent dignity. It's that God has imparted dignity to every human being. And so that's the reason God's holiness, and then the sort of the stamp of holiness in every human, is why that second of the table of the law makes sense. But like if we go back to what Jesus says about, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, then love your neighbor as yourself. You love your neighbor as yourself out of that love that you give to God, not as just sort of the second disconnected thing, but that it always flows from your relationship to God. And so, like thinking about the commandment, which is that you God hallowed the Sabbath and set it apart as holy. Taylor again has a really great sort of point about the underlying point about that. Then is that this is about recognizing God's work of creation, and that the rest there is not on God's part, like, unless we're going to anthropomorphize too much, it's not that God really needs to rest, but that it's about calling attention then to the work that God has done in creating the world. And then furthermore, the holiness then of the world as bearing the mark of God and being good because God is good.
Yeah. I love that idea of sort of a foundation that should be the true motivator for these other things. Because Christ taught a lot of awesome things. Yeah. But he was also very clear, here's the first commandment. Right? And it's not because those other things don't matter. It's because if you get this one right, those other things are going to come naturally. Yeah. They're going to fall into place.
Well, and I think honestly, in the ordering that Christ gives, if you can obviously love other people without knowing why you're doing it.
Sure.
But I think what Christ would say is, but without, once you start really digging deep, it doesn't matter if you're not doing this, right? That there's that fundamentally sort of once you have the grounding in knowledge, and so historically, in one of our articles of religion, the historic documents that sort of determined Anglican belief said that there are no good works prior to justification. There are sort of noble vices that you can do, but until you have been made right with God, everything that you do, regardless of how good you think the outcome is flowing from not the right intentions. And so it's not actually a good work. So there's no actual good works until after you've received that justification and forgiveness from God, from which point you can now begin to do good works. But I think that's a difficult thing to talk about because I think we're all closet utilitarians and we all think, well, what really makes something good or bad is what the outcome is.
Sure.
And that just has not historically been the framework that most Christian theology has worked out of.
One of the things I'm really appreciating right now is, don't get prideful about this, but I'm appreciating your humbleness here, right?
Oh,
your humbleness
well, yeah,
to recognize, like, I mean, you're a pretty impressive person. You do a lot of good things for the community. You work hard. You support your congregation, right?
Yeah.
And you're still saying, none of that's for me. That's all God, right? That's
yeah.
It's because of this connection with God.
Yes.
Right?
Or at least insofar as it starts to become for me, that's sinful.
Yeah, right. So would you say that as you're talking about the reason for this commandment being up with those others, would you say then, going to the specific benefits we get out of the Sabbath day, would you say one of them is a connection with God? Have you felt that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And would you mind, this is one where I don't feel like you have to get into anything too sacred or personal, but I would love to hear more about your personal connection with God. What does that mean to you? What does that look like? I think we benefit from hearing how other people connect with God, because then we can learn more how I can hear Him better in my life, how I can notice Him better in my life.
Yeah, I think that it normally relates to sort of these sort of breakthrough moments of clarity or lucidity, peace. That these moments where it really does feel kind of like time stands still, and those are not frequent for me. I mean, I can probably count on one hand the number of times that I've really had those sorts of things happen, but it's a sense that sort of everything is just absolutely clicking and really like the veil is being removed. Mm-hmm. And I can't say more than that because it's not, it doesn't really have, it really is more of a disposition towards the world thing. It's a sense of orientation in me, and again, a sense of my relationship to time. It's not as though like I see visions or any of that sort of stuff. But my relationship to all of my sense perceptions is changed in that moment. That's happened that happened once after just like riding home from doing my doctoral program, riding home from Vanderbilt to my apartment that I was staying at, and just got off my bike, and I kind of was struck by one of these times. But most of the other times have happened at some point when I'm celebrating the Eucharist, at some point in that service. And I think understandably, because our understanding is that Christ is in the elements and in the community gathered together there, in the actions that we're doing, really present in a different and more real way than Christ is really present in the rest of the world. And again, this gets into one of those sort of paradoxes for us where, yes, we obviously believe that God and God through Christ continues to be present in the world in a real way. Mm-hmm. But in some sense, Christ is present in a realer way in the actual sort of confines of that service, and then specifically in receiving the bread and wine.
This is one of the things that I love about doing this, because as you're talking about your experience, it sounds actually fairly similar to mine.
Yeah.
Right? And so that, I think sometimes we get so caught up in they have different doctrine, they have different beliefs.
Yeah.
So their experience with God is very different than mine, which is not always the case, right? Sometimes
right.
we have, God is working through us, and we're more connected, I think, than sometimes we imagine, right? And as I was thinking about, you're talking about the benefit, even it almost sounded like more clarity sometimes when you, right?
Yeah.
Like I think you said something like a turning, like he's directing you, that relationship. And then, so then if he's there more present during Eucharist, then we would hope then that the individuals coming to participate in that leave with more clarity of life.
Yeah, that's right. The way I have talked about it, so in the same way that we talk about Scripture not as the only place that we learn about who God is, but as canon, right? It's the norm that says this is how God is. And so if you are wondering in your studies and your experiences outside of that, is this really God? Is this really who God is? You always have to go back to the Bible and hold up the rule, right?
Yeah,
So canon historically, the origin of the term really means like cane. The word even is in there a little bit. But it was the measuring rod. And so, you want to see if this is the right size, you hold up the measuring rod.
Yep.
So I talk about the sacraments as kind of the canon of grace. if you want to see how God is imparting grace in other places in the world, you hold it up to the measuring rod of the sacraments.
Oh, I love that. That's cool. Well, I've sort of been all over the place just because I've loved your thoughts.
Yeah.
So we can go here. Do you have other benefits or cool things that you want to share about the Sabbath, either from you personally or from your religious aspect?
I don't. Well, I don't know. One of the big things that has been sort of taken hold, I'd say, in a lot of professional church world is talking about taking your Sabbath time, and that can kind of happen whenever your day off is. And I'm a little hesitant about transferring that just to any downtime you take, because I do think it's important to say we have this one day that has been set aside that connects us back to the day of resurrection, that is a special time to focus on the worship that yes, we need to unplug, we need to have time where we can rejuvenate, and that's just part of sort of our necessity as embodied creatures in the world, but that there seems to be something that we lose, and I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but there's something that we lose when we sort of make that focus on resurrection and on new creation that happens in the Lord's Day, and just make it anytime we kind of get some R&R. And so I am more inclined to say, I'll take my day off, and I have a day off, but that's not the same as my Sabbath.
Yeah, I would feel very similar about that. I remember reading somewhere, I don't remember where it was, but someone made the claim that you can notice the fall of civilizations tends to coincide with how they observe the Sabbath. As they become more lax in observing the Sabbath, they tend to dissolve in other ways, right?
Interesting.
I think part of this goes back to the selfish aspect we were talking about earlier too, because if it's just about me getting a day off, a day to go sleep and watch TV all day long, that doesn't really rejuvenate my soul in the same way going to worship God rejuvenates my soul. And so I'm going to see a deterioration, right? We hear people say sitting is the new smoking, right? Just this desire to be lazy and have a day off, right? That's not as healthy as when God says take a day off. It's not be lazy and do anything else. It's take a break from the world.
Well, and I think that also one of the things that's really unfortunate about the world is that the attempt to have these carved out sort of society-wide Sabbath spaces is coded as necessarily associated with like one political position or one, it's often coded as being specifically, that's the domain of conservative and moralistic type people, right? So we bring to mind like blue laws and temperance movement and like Chick-fil-A and those are the kinds of groups that still want to hold this space separate and open. And the Episcopal Church, I don't know if you know this, I say as a filler there, but the Episcopal Church tends to be more politically progressive. And I think that we really miss out on the justice aspects that have historically been associated with that we are not maybe as aware as we should be of the ways in which the people who tend to have to work on Sundays when we expect services to be open all the time are low-wage earners. They are people who don't actually tend to get regular weekends off because they're not working regular 9-to-5 jobs. And that historically the strong observance in a community of the Sabbath and the prevention of commerce, particularly on the Sabbath, was associated with giving workers a break, right? That this was the one day that you could be guaranteed that hourly or wage workers wouldn't be required to work, and I think that's a real missing thing from that conversation. It's not just about a kind of petty moralism. It's not just about saying, oh well, you shouldn't be able to sell alcohol on the Sabbath even if you can sell it the rest of the day, rest of the week. It's about saying, who are the people who actually end up bearing the brunt of our expectation of being able to be going all the time. In the ancient world, of course, this was one of the things that set Judaism quite apart. I mean, that made them seem really strange was that they didn't work one day a week. And so, like in the early church, the Lord's Day was often observed quite early because you had to do it to make sure that everyone, including manual laborers who had to be working all day, were able to come before they had to actually work. And I think that was one of the real benefits, and similarly with like a robust saints calendar, that like in the medieval world, people worked a lot less than they do today. It was just less hours during the day, often because you were confined by sunlight. But then you had all these holy days and Sabbaths that you didn't have to work. And I think that there is something that's been significantly lost with the inability to recognize that it can be very easy to begin getting comfortable with exploitation of the least of these when there's not these set aside things that say, no, we're all just going to take a break.
Interesting. Yeah, I think to me that brings up a message that I wish would provide more common ground, because I think I see it with my colleagues who are very different than me, or my friends who have very different political ideologies. I think the common ground is a lot of people do care right now about protecting the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's different approaches to what that might look like. But if that's our common ground, and I love this, you're saying that the Sabbath, if we as a community keep the Sabbath, in one way that protects the vulnerable by giving them a break as well.
Yeah. No, I think that they should have to, it should also be not a day where they have to lose wages, right?
Sure.
Like you're not really protecting anyone if, it's sort of like when I heard that there would be like, I heard about, I don't know, it was the paper mill or something in Appleton, used to always just close over the holidays. And then you'd have this uptick in people going and trying to get assistance to make rent because it was closed. That's not the way that you solve the problem, right? You paid Sabbath, I think, is what you would need to make sure that you do, similar to like paid holidays. But the idea that, oh, well, the way that we really solve it is just to make sure that they have the work available, that's a suboptimal solution. The real optimal solution is to say we're going to take a Sabbath and people are going to get paid as though they went in for a full work day.
Yeah, interesting. That's cool. Anything else you want to throw in as we wrap up? I think really appreciate your thoughts.
That's great. I hope that this is helpful.
No, it's very helpful for me. I might even ask you to start thinking about, my goal next year is each week I'm going to pick a different name of Christ.
Oh, yeah.
So to learn the different aspects of who he is. So if you've got a cool name you like to think about, I might come back to you.
Yeah, I will. I'll think about it a little bit.
And hear your thoughts on that.
Great.
So, awesome.